Good afternoon, curious people. Today I want to take a few minutes to share something that just popped into my mind this morning. And while I was slurping my coffee in the coffee shop, I had this idea, maybe a realization about systems in experimentation. And I want to start this off with a quote, or rather a concept from the book Atomic Habits. And if you've read the book, you will. This won't be a foreign thing to you. But it's essentially the idea that you do not rise to the level of your goals or your aspirations, but essentially you will fall to the level of your systems. And while this works, is true very much in your personal life, or in anybody's personal life, this also applies to different kind of systems and environments where you have goals, but also like default operating modes, right? Default ways of behaving, essentially your systems, right? Or that are supported by your systems. And I was thinking this morning about how this affects the systems we have in experimentation. Because for a long time, I was thinking about experimentation and there being essentially one system. When this morning I realized, by reference of another book, that there is actually multiple systems at play. So today I'm going to talk a bit about how evidence becomes business value through experimentation and value compounding systems, or rather what I call value compounding systems. Now, I think that the quote here is quite straightforward. I don't think we need to go too deep into it. But the first part, and I found this cool reveal function here, is actually from a book that, if you just look at it, might look a bit funny. But it's a book, The Millionaire Fastlane, a book I read, I think, first time in 2021. Amazing book, amazing concepts. And one of the core concepts here is this idea of having or building a business system, like a scalable system that consistently creates value for your customers and generates cash flow with decreasing reliance on the owner's time. Now, if you've worked in a startup or built any kind of company from the ground up, this is typically what people build, right? But then there's a second system, which is the money system, a system for preserving, allocating, and growing the cash generated by the business into long-term wealth and income-producing assets, right? This is the business system, is like the active thing, that the active system that's generating value, and the money system is what's actually preserving it and growing it long-term. Now, how do we apply this to an experimentation program? The way I see it is that in an experimentation program, we also have two systems. One is the experimentation system, right? A repeatable system for generating value, for generating validated evidence by testing our assumptions and reducing uncertainty, at the same time also exploring new opportunities. And then there is the value compounding system, because this is to the point where we have evidence and where we generate value, generate like evidence from our experiments, generate new insights, etc. But in the value compounding system, this is the moment our learnings, but also the actually implemented experiments, the rollouts, whatever it might be, depending on the kind of program you're running, or the way you're running your program. This is where our learnings, our experiments really find their way into producing value for the business, right? This in various ways. So essentially, this means for us that an experimentation program has two jobs. And I think sometimes it's so easy to try to push for capturing value, which is what the system, like value compounding system, is essentially doing, and ignoring what the first part. Well, really, like we should be focusing on generating evidence and then really trying to capture the value. the part that most organizations miss is they build the first system while trying to push for the second, the outcome or the output of the second one. And very few build the actual second system that is compounding it. And this is why, in my opinion, a lot of companies struggle to demonstrate the long-term ROI, not just the short-term wins, having a few really cool fancy experiments that like show crazy value in the short term, but actually show and demonstrate long-term return on investment from an experimentation program. And why so many programs go stale the moment some crucial person leaves, because the organization often doesn't understand the value this program is really driving. So maybe to make this a bit more easy to grasp, at least this is what did it for me this morning, is if we take the typical example from the Millionaire Fastlane, or at least one that I derived from it, it is like, it is like you, or like if you have a business, like building the business system, right? Building the system that generates the cash flow, right? This is very active. And then from that cash flow, funding the money system that buys the assets, that ultimately maybe not acquires, but like builds financial independence. Now, if we look at this, it becomes quite clear that the main actions, part of the business system, is not chasing the money. Which is funny, because if I overlay this on what this would mean for our experimentation program, this would be running the experiments, doing the research, building the processes, etc. None of this is directly buying us assets for the future. None of this is generating value in the business sense directly. But it is building the foundation that over time generates value for the business, right? So if I, for example, look at very immature experimentation programs, all they try to do, or oftentimes at least that's the case, is try to generate revenue, right? Generate these metrics that are part of the second system, right? The value compounding system. All right. For those who have already spent a bit of time, or maybe got their head around the idea of systems in a more scientific way, maybe, I highly recommend taking a look at this book by Donella Meadows. I listened to it over a few weeks in the car about half a year ago, and was very transformational. The way she describes systems is essentially having three components, and we'll go into the behaviors in just a second. So there's like the first component is like these tangible or identifiable parts of the systems, right? In our case, this could be people, teams, processes, products, and even experiments. Then there's the relationships, the interconnections between those elements, right? And information flows between, how information flows between those elements. And this helps us understand how they influence one another. And then there is more of the foundation to all of it, is like, what is the system ultimately trying to accomplish? And not just trying, but what does it actually accomplish, right? And often it is funny how like the real purpose, or at least the purpose we ascribe to a system, is revealed by the behaviors and not just necessarily by its stated goals, right? So, for example, if we have an experimentation system, right, or an experimentation program consisting of multiple systems, where we say our main goal is generating learnings for the company. But our actions show more, the only thing we care about is like generating revenue, and we don't really follow the process, the methodology, etc. It's quite clear that the stated goals do not align with the actions, the habits, and ultimately also with the culture that is present in the company. Now there's a second category within systems, which is how does behavior work? One is this concept of stocks. And we're not talking about stocks in the stock market sense, but in how if you have like inventory, right? How things accumulate. This could be money, customers, but even less tangible things like knowledge or validated insights, right? Then we have flows, and obviously the book goes into way more detail into all of these concepts. But then we have flows, which is basically the activities that increase or decrease these stocks. For example, knowledge, validated insights. With insights, it could also be something, for example, like how outdated the learnings are, as I'll show in just a second. Then feedback loops, right? If we're talking about experimentation programs, often we have this this flywheel that a few papers talk about, or the general concept. But essentially, everything we're doing ideally has a feedback loop. What I see in a lot of experimentation programs, though, is especially the more immature kind, is that the feedback loops of themselves are not really feedback loops that really feed the next loop, but oftentimes they just stop, which makes them very inefficient, or oftentimes makes the program inefficient. And then we have delays. This could be in just looking at the wrong metrics, right? We're trying to see a difference in actual revenue from our experiments. We can't really see that, right? Oftentimes. So there could be various kinds of delays in the system. Now, how does this apply to our idea of having this experimentation program with both an experimentation system, or maybe call it even operating system, and then this value compounding system? Well, the experimentation system is, again, what produces the evidence, and the growth and compounding system, or value compounding system, turns that evidence into accumulating business value. And if it doesn't work properly, accumulating might be exchanged for dissolving business value, right? This is if the feedback loops don't properly work, or rather they work, but in a deterioratory way. So if we take these elements and put them to our experimentation system, here especially the elements are the people, research, hypotheses that we have, the tools we have available, experiments, and the various kinds of data. Then the interconnection between those elements might look like prioritization, experimentation processes, the decision rules, the SOPs, right, the various kind of things, but also our general approach to knowledge sharing within the organization, but also just within teams, to like rising up and down through the organization. Then the purpose, I'd say ideally, of this experimentation system is to produce reliable evidence and reduce uncertainty, then for the actions taken within the value compounding system. And the flows, like what's essentially happening between our stocks, might look like new experiments add knowledge, and forgotten or inaccessible or undocumented or outdated learnings reduce its usefulness of the knowledge. Now, I'll first go to the value compounding system. And here the elements are like product teams, right? The people finally making the product decisions, the implementation resources we have available, roadmaps, general playbooks, and ultimately also our decision makers, right? Independent of where they sit in the organization. Then we have the interconnections of between our stocks. This might be rollout processes, governance, documentation, but also how we use and reuse or productize the learnings that we gain from experiments. And the purpose of this system is purely converting the evidence that is the output of our experimentation system, to business value, ideally sustained business value. Maybe I'll underline that. And then the stocks here, maybe I should have moved that up as a first element here, is the implemented improvements, how reusable or just reusable knowledge, but also over time building the organizational capability to run experiments and to also then draw the right conclusions from them. And ultimately, the accumulated financial impact, although this is probably what most people stress on, underestimating the fact that it is just a stock and not the ultimate outcome. And then flows might look also like, again here, rollout of winners, prevention of losses, reusing of insights, but then the standardization or productization of patterns that we see. Now, how do these two systems actually interact with one another? This is what I describe as the value capture flow. Because as I described so far in the experimentation system, what we do or what we get is like validated knowledge. We gain evidence, right? This system produces evidence. And our value capture flow, and this can have various forms, but is essentially moving this evidence from a completed experiment into implementation. And a lot of times this is super simple in organizations, right? We have an experiment that might look significant and people just implement it. Unfortunately, a lot of times this is where it stops. And it captures a tiny amount of that value. In my experience, but also generally my opinion, the bigger part of the value is captured the moment we document these decisions, the learnings that come from this experiment. It doesn't matter whether or not it is a so-called winning experiment, but capturing that, turning that into reusable knowledge, or at least additional insights to be then reused in further experiments or other kinds of explorations, and using that, as I just said, for future experimentation. This is where this feedback loop ultimately compounds, because we don't just stop and do one iteration and then start over again, but we have these smaller loops that over time compound and really help make the experimentation program successful. So again, there's a lot of things I try to cover here, and I really hope this helped maybe understand that it is not just about the individual actions in an experimentation program, or, for example, how well you prioritize, or if it matters at all, how well you form your hypotheses, but it is rather about the system that helps your teams, even if you're just a single practitioner, but generally in your organization, how well your systems are laid out, how good of care you're taking of the systems, because again, you do not rise to the level of your goals, but fall to the level of your systems. All right, thanks so much for listening. If you care about these kind of topics, if you like these kind of explorations, I'd be super happy to hear. Or if you see any way to improve this kind of thinking, I'm super happy to hear your feedback. And maybe share in the comments down below, what kind of systems you have built in your experimentation program. And looking forward to see you in the next one. Bye-bye.